1. Prologue, A Skeptic's Life. Before spirituality became a part of my life, I was the kind of person who relied on logic, reason, and what I could see with my own eyes. The world, to me, was a collection of scientific facts and predictable outcomes. Life had a beginning and an end, simple, finite, with no grand mysteries beyond what we already knew. I wasn't necessarily an atheist, but I wasn't a believer either. If someone had asked me whether I thought there was an afterlife, I would have shrugged and said, probably not. Death was, in my mind, the end of everything. No soul, no reincarnation, no floating spirits watching over us. Just darkness. Nothingness. And for a long time, that idea didn't bother me. If anything, I found comfort in it. Life was short, and that meant it was meant to be lived fully, with no expectation of something after. I was indifferent to religion. I had friends who prayed, family members who believed in fate and karma, and acquaintances who spoke about spiritual awakenings with awe in their eyes. I listened, but I never felt the need to challenge them. If it brought them peace, good for them. But it wasn't for me. Then something happened that cracked the foundation of my certainty. It wasn't a grand event, not at first. It wasn't a near-death experience or an out-of-body revelation. It was something far simpler, a phone call. I still remember the way my heart thumped as I picked up. A relative, someone I had known my entire life, someone who had been there through childhood birthdays and family gatherings, had passed away. It was sudden, unexpected. One day they were here, laughing, telling stories. The next, gone. Just like that. For the first time, death didn't feel like an abstract concept. It wasn't something that only happened to other people, far away from my own world. It was real, it was final, and it had taken someone I cared about. And yet, in the days that followed, something strange happened. I started noticing things. Odd little coincidences. A song playing on the radio, their favorite song, at the exact moment I was thinking about them. A dream so vivid it felt like more than a dream, where I spoke to them, where they told me something I had no way of knowing. A feeling, unexplainable but undeniable, that they were still there, somehow. I wanted to dismiss it. I told myself it was my grief playing tricks on me, my mind searching for meaning in randomness. But deep down, I wasn't sure. For the first time in my life, I wasn't sure. And that was where it all began. 2. The first encounter with loss. When I think back to my first real encounter with loss, I see my grandfather's face. Strong, weathered, yet always carrying a softness when he looked at me. He was the kind of person who never raised his voice, never needed to. His presence alone commanded respect, but it was never forced. It was earned through kindness, wisdom, and a quiet strength that made you feel safe just being around him. He was the storyteller of our family. Sitting in his worn-out armchair, he would spin tales from his youth, some real, some exaggerated, and some, I suspect, entirely made up for our amusement. But it never mattered. We hung on to every word. He had a way of making the simplest moments feel grand, like turning a walk in the park into an adventure or a meal at the table into a lesson about life. I never imagined a world without him in it. The phone call came on an otherwise ordinary evening. I remember the way the sky looked, grayish-blue, the last hints of daylight fading. My mother's voice was different the moment she said my name. There was a pause, too long, before she spoke again. Then, just 2 words. He's gone. I don't remember what I said in response. Maybe nothing. Maybe I mumbled something incoherent. But I do remember the way the words crashed over me. Gone. Not sick. Not in the hospital. Not recovering. Just gone. It didn't make sense. People don't just vanish from the world like that. One moment, he had been real, breathing, talking, existing, and the next, he was a past tense, a name people would now say with sadness instead of warmth. I didn't cry. Not right away. Instead, I did what I had always done in moments of distress, I rationalized. I nodded when my mother spoke, I acknowledged the details, I asked practical questions. When's the funeral? What do we need to do? I busied myself with logistics, with information, anything that didn't require me to actually feel. Grief, I thought, was something that came in waves. Something dramatic, something visible. Tears, breakdowns, sleepless nights. But for me, it was silence. A hollow space inside me that I didn't know how to fill. I went back to my daily routine as if nothing had changed. I went to work, I responded to texts, I laughed at jokes, I did everything a person who wasn't grieving was supposed to do. If I ignored it, maybe it would just pass. Maybe this emptiness was temporary. But then the little things started happening. I'd reach for my phone, intending to call him, only to remember halfway through. I'd hear a joke and think, Grandpa would love that, before realizing I couldn't tell him. His chair at family gatherings remained empty, untouched, a ghostly reminder that something was missing. And yet, even then, I refused to let myself believe in anything beyond what I could explain. I heard relatives say, he's watching over us now or he's in a better place, but I didn't buy it. He wasn't anywhere. He was just, gone. That was how death worked. But if that was true, why did it feel like he wasn't really gone? It was a small feeling at first. A flicker of something I couldn't name. An odd sense that he was still there, just out of reach. I ignored it, convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But the more I pushed it away, the more it seemed to press back. I didn't know it at the time, but his death had planted something in me, an unease, a question I couldn't answer. It would take time, but eventually, I would stop trying to ignore it. 3. Searching for meaning in the pain. Grief is strange. People talk about it like a storm, violent, overwhelming, something that crashes into you all at once. But for me, it was quieter. It was like standing in the middle of an empty street, watching life continue around me, yet feeling like I didn't belong to it anymore. In the weeks following my grandfather's death, I walked through life in a daze. I functioned, I went to work, answered messages, did everything expected of me, but it was all mechanical. The world felt muted, like the volume had been turned down on everything that once felt real. I wasn't sad in the way people expected. I wasn't crying every day or visibly broken. But something in me had shifted. A small crack had formed in the certainty I used to have about life, about death, about everything in between. And I didn't know how to fix it. At first, I turned inward. I tried to logic my way through the pain. Death is natural. Everyone dies. This is just part of life. But none of those thoughts helped. Instead, they made me feel worse, like I was forcing myself to move on before I was ready. Anger came next, though I didn't recognize it at first. It wasn't directed at anyone in particular, just a deep frustration at the way everything worked. How could someone be here one moment and gone the next? How could memories, entire lifetimes, just disappear like that? And more than anything, how was everyone else okay with it? I started paying closer attention to how people talked about death. Some of my relatives found comfort in religion. They said things like, he's in a better place now or you'll see him again someday. I wanted to believe them, I really did. But those words felt empty to me, like something people said because they needed to believe it, not because it was real. Others tried to rationalize it. At least he lived a long life or this is just the way things are. Those explanations were logical, but they didn't help either. They only reinforced the finality of it all, the idea that once someone was gone, they were truly gone. Then there were the people who simply avoided the topic altogether, as if mentioning his name might somehow bring the grief back to life. I understood that too, death made people uncomfortable. It reminded them of their own mortality, of the people they might lose one day. So instead, they moved on quickly, while I was still standing there, trying to make sense of it all. It wasn't until a conversation with an old friend that something shifted. We hadn't talked in a while, but when she heard about my grandfather, she reached out. We met for coffee, and for the first time, I let my guard down. I told her everything, the numbness, the anger, the way nothing felt real anymore. She listened, really listened, and then she said something I didn't expect. "You know, I don't think he's really gone." I almost rolled my eyes. Here it was, the same thing I'd heard from my relatives, wrapped in a different package. But before I could dismiss it, she continued. Not in a religious way, she clarified. But energy doesn't just disappear. Maybe he's still here in some way. Maybe you just have to pay attention. I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell her that wasn't how science worked, that people didn't just linger after death. But something about her words stuck with me. I started noticing things. A week later, I found an old letter from my grandfather tucked away in a drawer I swore I had already checked. The handwriting was familiar, steady, and in it, he had written something that hit me hard. You don't always have to understand everything. Some things just are. It wasn't proof of anything. It wasn't a sign, not really. But for the first time, I started wondering. What if? What if there was more than I had ever allowed myself to believe? 4. Strange coincidences or signs. Grief is supposed to fade with time. That's what people say, at least. But instead of fading, mine twisted into something new, an unsettling curiosity. I still didn't believe in anything beyond what I could see and explain. And yet, strange things started happening. Small things at first, little moments that felt off, but not enough to make me question reality. At least, not right away. The watch that shouldn't have ticked. A few weeks after my grandfather's funeral, I found his old wristwatch in a box of his belongings. It was one of those classic analog watches with a leather strap, the kind he used to wind every morning. I turned it over in my hands, expecting silence. It had been sitting untouched for weeks, maybe months. There was no way it was still running. Except it was. The second hand ticked forward, steady and rhythmic, as if it had never stopped. I frowned, checked the time. It was correct, down to the minute. That didn't make sense. I asked my mom if she had wound it recently. She hadn't. Neither had anyone else. It should have stopped working long ago. I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe it had more power reserve than I realized. Maybe someone had wound it and forgotten. That was easier to believe than the alternative. And yet, when I set it down on my nightstand, I couldn't help but stare at it, waiting for it to stop. It never did, not until months later, on a day that would bring its own strange series of events. The dream that felt too real. Not long after the watch incident, I had a dream. In it, my grandfather was sitting in his usual armchair, wearing the same old cardigan he always wore. Everything about him was exactly as I remembered, his warm smile, his steady voice, the way he folded his hands when he spoke. "You're thinking too much," he told me, his voice amused but gentle. "You always do that." I wanted to say something back, to tell him I missed him, to ask if this was real. But I couldn't. It was like my voice had been taken from me. Instead, he just smiled. "I'm still here, you know." And then I woke up. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. It had been so vivid, so real. I could still hear his voice in my head, still feel the warmth of his presence. I told myself it was just a dream. Nothing more. Dreams were memories rearranging themselves, that's all. But if that was true, why did it feel different? Why did it feel like something else? The day everything lined up. One afternoon, I was driving home from work when I felt an overwhelming sense of sadness. There was no real reason for it. Grief had been coming in waves, unpredictable, but this time it was heavier, almost suffocating. I reached for the radio, hoping for a distraction. The first song that played stopped me cold. It was my grandfather's favorite song. A song I hadn't heard in years. I gripped the steering wheel, my mind racing. Coincidence? That's what I told myself. But then, just as the song ended, I glanced at the dashboard clock. 4:44. I didn't know much about numerology, but I had heard something about repeating numbers having significance. Later that night, curiosity got the best of me, and I looked it up. Apparently, 444 was considered an angel number, a sign that someone who had passed was near, watching over you. I shut my laptop, scoffing at my own thoughts. I wasn't one of those people who believed in signs from the universe. But the feeling in my chest didn't go away. The struggle between logic and belief. I wanted to dismiss all of it. The ticking watch, the dream, the song, the numbers. I wanted to tell myself they meant nothing, that my brain was just finding patterns where there weren't any. But another part of me wasn't so sure anymore. What if these weren't just coincidences? What if I had spent my whole life rejecting things simply because I couldn't prove them? I wrestled with these thoughts for days, caught between skepticism and something else, something I wasn't ready to name yet. Maybe grief was playing tricks on me. Or maybe, just maybe, my grandfather had never really left. 5. A turning point, the experience that changed everything. If the strange coincidences and eerie signs had been gentle nudges, this was a full-force collision, an experience so powerful that it shattered every belief I had held about life, death, and everything in between. I didn't ask for it. I didn't seek it out. But it happened anyway, and there was no going back. The night that everything shifted. It was late, past midnight, when it happened. I had been struggling with sleep for weeks, my mind trapped in an endless cycle of grief and unanswered questions. That night, exhaustion finally won, and I drifted into a heavy, dreamless sleep. At least, that's what I thought. Somewhere in the darkness of sleep, I became aware of a presence. It wasn't like a dream. Dreams are hazy, disjointed, fragmented things. This was different. I was in my childhood home, standing in the dim glow of the living room lamp. The air was thick with a warmth I couldn't explain, a strange, almost electric energy humming all around me. And then, I saw him. My grandfather. He was sitting in his usual chair, just like in my earlier dreams, but this time, something was different. This time, I could feel him. The weight of him in the room, the unmistakable presence of another being. I wasn't just seeing him, I was with him. He looked at me, eyes full of knowing. "You're not dreaming," he said. A shock of fear ran through me. My breathing turned shallow. This wasn't normal. This wasn't possible. I wanted to speak, but my throat was dry. My mind was racing with questions. What is this? How are you here? But before I could say anything, he reached out and placed a hand on mine. The moment his skin touched mine, something exploded inside me. The flood of memory, the collapse of time. It was as if someone had unlocked a door in my mind that had been shut my entire life. A rush of memories, feelings, and emotions overwhelmed me all at once, not just mine, but his too. I knew things I had no way of knowing. I felt his love, his regrets, his joy. I saw moments from his life flash through my mind, things he had never told me, moments from his childhood, his final thoughts before passing. And then, just as suddenly, I was outside of myself, floating above the room, watching us from somewhere else. Time didn't exist. I wasn't just me, I was everything. I could feel the presence of something vast, something infinite, something that had been there all along but that I had been too blind to see. There was no fear, no confusion, only peace. A deep, overwhelming knowing filled me. The kind of knowing that doesn't come from books or theories, but from experiencing something firsthand. Death wasn't an end. He was still here. And so was everyone else who had ever been. The return to reality. And then, just like that, it was over. I gasped awake, my body drenched in sweat, my heart hammering against my ribs. The room was dark, silent, but I was shaking with something I couldn't name. I sat up, my mind reeling. Had that been a dream? A hallucination? Some kind of stress-induced vision? I reached for my phone to check the time. The screen glowed back at me, 4:44 a.m. A shiver ran through me. No. This wasn't just my imagination. This was real. Processing the impossible. For hours, I sat in bed, trying to make sense of what had happened. A part of me, the rational, skeptical part, wanted to dismiss it. Maybe it was just my brain coping with grief, a deeply vivid dream formed from wishful thinking. But another part of me knew better. I had never felt anything like that before. No dream had ever left me with such an intense, undeniable knowing. And the strangest part? I wasn't afraid. For the first time since my grandfather's passing, I felt at peace. I didn't need to understand it logically. I just knew. Something had changed in me that night, something irreversible. I wasn't the same person I had been before I closed my eyes. The world had cracked open. And I was finally ready to step through. 6. The journey into spirituality. The night of my grandfather's visit changed everything. Before that, spirituality had been nothing more than an abstract idea, something other people believed in, something I had dismissed as wishful thinking. But after that experience, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The question was no longer is there something more? But what is it, and how do I understand it? Dipping my toes into the unknown. At first, I was hesitant. My logical mind tried to push back, telling me it was just a vivid dream, a trick of the brain. But something deep inside me, something beyond reason, was urging me to look deeper. I started small. Late at night, when I knew no one would judge me, I searched the internet for stories like mine. I read about near-death experiences, dream visitations, and strange synchronicities that others had encountered. For the first time, I realized I wasn't alone. That led me to books. I picked up works by authors I had once dismissed as New Age nonsense. Books about energy, the afterlife, consciousness, and the universe. Some of them resonated deeply, making my chest tighten with recognition, as if I was remembering something I had always known but forgotten. Others felt too far-fetched, too wrapped in flowery language, and I tossed them aside. But one thing was clear, I was on a path, whether I fully understood it or not. Meditation, the gateway to something more. It wasn't long before I stumbled upon meditation. I had always thought meditation was just about relaxation, a technique to calm the mind. But now, people were claiming it was a doorway to something greater, to deeper awareness, to unseen realms, to direct experiences beyond the physical world. Skeptical but curious, I decided to try. The first attempts were frustrating. My mind wouldn't stop racing, my body wouldn't sit still, and I felt ridiculous sitting in silence, waiting for something to happen. But I kept at it. Every day, I carved out a few minutes, just to see if anything would change. And then, one evening, something did. The first moment of true connection. I was sitting in my room, eyes closed, focusing on my breath. My thoughts had slowed, and for the first time, I wasn't fighting them, I was just there. Then, out of nowhere, a wave of warmth washed over me. It wasn't external, it was inside me, around me, through me. It felt like stepping into sunlight after being in the cold for too long, a deep, overwhelming sense of love and peace that I couldn't explain. I wasn't alone. I wasn't just a body, just a mind. I was something more, something infinite. Tears spilled down my face, though I wasn't sad. It was as if, for the first time, I understood. Not in a way that could be explained, not in words or concepts, but in feeling. I opened my eyes, gasping, staring at my hands as if they belonged to someone else. I had no idea what had just happened, but I knew, without question, that I had touched something beyond myself. The struggle between doubt and trust. That moment should have sealed my faith, but instead, it brought another battle, the war between my old beliefs and the new ones forming inside me. Some days, I felt completely sure. I could feel the shift in my heart, the certainty that there was more beyond this physical life. Other days, doubt crept in, whispering that I was being ridiculous. That I was making things up, chasing illusions. I still clung to logic, still craved explanations. So I tested it. I kept meditating. I kept reading. I started journaling my dreams, paying attention to small coincidences in my daily life. And the more I opened myself to it, the more I saw. I met people, strangers who spoke of the same experiences, who validated what I was going through without knowing me at all. Conversations with old friends led to unexpected revelations. Some of them had been through similar awakenings but had been too afraid to talk about it. The more I trusted, the more things unfolded. The first real leap of faith. The real test came when I had to make a choice, to keep this journey to myself, hidden behind skepticism and logic, or to fully step into it, even if it meant unlearning everything I had believed before. It wasn't easy. But I remembered the warmth of my grandfather's touch. I remembered the night I felt the universe inside me. And I realized, I had already stepped through the door. There was no going back. 7. Facing another loss, but this time, it's different. Loss came again, as it always does. But this time, I was different. It was my mother. She had been my anchor, the one person who had always felt like home. The thought of losing her had once been unbearable, a fear I pushed away every time it surfaced. And yet, here I was, standing in the hospital room, watching her take her final breath. The moment of goodbye. The machines had gone silent. The air was still, thick with the weight of something unspoken. The nurses murmured softly, moving around me, but I barely heard them. I reached for her hand. It was warm but lifeless. I waited for the familiar flood of grief, the gut-wrenching pain, the numbness, the denial. But something was different. Yes, my heart ached. Yes, the tears came. But beneath it all, there was something else. A quiet knowing. She wasn't gone. Not really. Grief without despair. In the days that followed, I felt the sadness, but it didn't consume me the way it had before. I didn't spiral into the same dark hole of why and how and where did she go. Because I knew now. I knew she was still here, just not in the way I had once understood. I spoke to her. In quiet moments, in the stillness of the night, I whispered her name, and I felt her presence, subtle but certain. It wasn't just imagination. It was the same warmth I had felt during meditation, the same sense of connection I had first experienced after my grandfather's visit. She wasn't lost. And for the first time in my life, I faced death without fear. The difference between then and now. I thought back to the first time I had lost someone, to the hollow emptiness that had swallowed me whole. Back then, death had been an ending, an irreversible void. Now, it felt like a transition. I didn't need to see her, to touch her, to know she still was. There was a moment, maybe a week after the funeral, when I woke up in the middle of the night. I wasn't sure why, but I felt drawn to the window. As I stood there, staring at the quiet sky, a familiar warmth wrapped around me. And I heard her voice. Not with my ears, but in my heart. I'm here. It wasn't wishful thinking. It wasn't a desperate mind searching for comfort. It was her. And in that moment, I truly understood. 8. Living with a new perspective. Life hasn't been the same since I embraced spirituality. It wasn't a sudden transformation, there was no grand moment where I became an entirely different person overnight. But gradually, the way I saw the world, the way I moved through each day, changed in ways I never expected. A different way of seeing life, I used to wake up with a sense of urgency, a feeling that time was slipping through my fingers, that I needed to chase something: success, security, certainty. Now, I wake up and simply exist. Not in a passive way, but in a way that allows me to be fully present. Small moments hold a new depth. A breeze through the trees feels like a message. A stranger's kindness feels like an echo of something greater. The world feels connected in a way I had never noticed before. How relationships changed. I no longer see people as just bodies moving through life, separate from one another. I feel the energy that connects us. Conversations are deeper, love is felt more intensely, and even difficult people don't seem as threatening. When conflicts arise, I no longer feel the need to prove a point or defend myself. I understand that everyone is on their own journey, carrying their own pain, their own lessons. Instead of reacting, I listen. Instead of holding grudges, I let go. The absence of fear. The fear of death, which had once kept me awake at night, no longer haunts me. I've come to see it as part of the cycle, as natural as breathing. There was a moment, one that made me realize just how much I had changed. I was driving alone on a quiet highway when I had a sudden thought: if I died right now, I wouldn't be afraid. Not that I wanted to die, life still had beauty, and I still had much to experience. But the fear was gone. I smiled to myself, feeling an overwhelming peace settle over me. Do I still have doubts? There are moments when my old skepticism creeps in. My logical mind asks, what if you're wrong? What if there's nothing after this? But then something happens, a dream, a synchronicity, a deep inner knowing, and I remember. Faith, I've learned, isn't about having all the answers. It's about trusting in what feels true, even when you can't explain it. And that trust has become my foundation. 9. The final realization, a peaceful acceptance. There was no dramatic awakening, no sudden surge of enlightenment, just a quiet moment where everything fell into place. I was sitting alone by the ocean, watching the waves move in endless cycles. The tide came in, then retreated, only to return again. It was the same water, shifting, changing, yet never truly gone. And in that moment, I understood. Death was not an ending. It was a transition. I thought of everyone I had lost: my grandfather, my mother, the people whose absence had once left an unbearable void. But were they really gone? I carried them in my heart, in my memories, in the lessons they left behind. Sometimes, I even felt them, as if their presence lingered just beyond what my eyes could see. Life and death were not opposites, but part of the same flow. The same energy. The same existence. The final lesson. Looking back on my journey, I realized that spirituality hadn't just changed how I saw death, it had changed how I lived. I no longer rushed through life, fearing the inevitable end. I no longer saw time as something slipping away. Every moment mattered, not because it was fleeting, but because it was eternal in its own way. I stopped searching for meaning in the grand things and started finding it in the smallest moments: a deep breath, a shared laugh, the warmth of the sun on my skin. There was no need to chase answers anymore. No need to fear what was to come. I was here. I was alive. And one day, I would transition too, not into nothingness, but into something beyond my current understanding. And for the first time, that thought didn't scare me. It brought me peace.